of its founders and a lifelong resident of the Hudson Valley. He has studied plants and animals of the region for 45 years and has co-authored or authored 80 publications, 200 technical assistance reports on wetland ecology, rare species conservation, habitat ecology, introduced species, the Hudson River, and other subjects. He's also a certified wetland scientist. And Erik has been a member, a partner in the PRISM since its inception, representing Hudsonia. So let's see if we can get his screen shared.
Thank you, Linda. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have the slide thumbnails up on the screen. Can you see those?
No, we can't see.
All right. Let's see what I need to do here. I don't seem to be getting any action out of the share screen button.
Uh-oh. Are you seeing the button? There.
Does this help?
Yep. Yep. That's
okay, so you can see the thumbnails now.
Yes. Yes.
All right, very good. So I'm going to focus on identification of some selected invasive marsh plants that we have in the region or we might have soon. And I've been working on the natural history of Phragmites and purple loosestrife since the 1970s and knotweed for about the last 20 years. I have less experience with these other species, but if there are questions, please use the chat board and Joyce or Linda will alert me to those. So let's start with Butomus, flowering rush. This is very localized in our region. I believe there's one Hudson River record. I don't know where that has been found yet, but it's an easy to identify flower when the plant is flowering, and it's certainly something that should be watched for. It's up in the St. Lawrence River, and it's in other places that are probably connected hydrologically to the Hudson. So these are the flowers, and this is what the plant looks like from a little farther away. It's a graminoid that is a grass-like plant, and you can see that if it were not flowering, you probably wouldn't pay much attention to it, but certainly the flowers should be watched for. This is a plant that's very interesting to me and a little bit curious because this also is still very rare in our region. It's called hairy willow herb or great hairy willow herb. And the most distinctive feature is that, let's see, can you see my pointer? Linda or Joyce?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, very good. So if you look in the center of the flower, there's a cross-shaped white stigma, which is in the center or slightly off-center in this case. And it's pretty conspicuous. This flower is about 2 centimeters across. The plant gets to be rather tall. It can be, I would say, 1.5 meters or taller. I know this currently from one station in eastern Dutchess County. I've seen it a little bit in areas north of here, but I've also seen a couple of occurrences, such as at Thompson Pond in Dutchess County, where it seems to have disappeared over the years. So this is not a ranked species for the lower Hudson prism, at least not yet. It's something to watch for. It may be ephemeral and not of concern, but it has been studied in Europe, where it seems to be, or at least according to one researcher, a plant that's very competitive with purple loosestrife. So that, makes me think this is something that should be on our radar. Now, moving on to knotweed. Knotweed is two parent species that are generally known as Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed. Unfortunately, these plants have been put in three different genera: Polygonum, Rhinutria, and Fallopia. So I'm not going to tell you whether I have a favorite genus name. People argue about this, not me. The interesting thing is that these two parent species have hybridized very widely, apparently. They seem to be quite closely related. They've created a hybrid swarm, which is a situation in which the hybrids backcross with one or both of the parent species. And so you get a range of variation in morphological and genetic characteristics. I don't trust myself to distinguish the hybrid from what you're seeing in this photograph, which is fairly typical, apparently parent Japanese knotweed. It could be a hybrid that looks like Japanese knotweed. The character that's I find particularly useful here is that the base of the leaf is truncate. It's almost straight across. There's certainly variation, as you can see here, from a leaf that's very slightly heart-shaped or cordate at the base to one that's very nearly straight across. And these leaves are about the size of someone's hand. That's important because giant knotweed has much larger leaves when they're fully developed. Here are Japanese knotweed so-called flowers. And not surprisingly, in this photograph, there's an insect visiting the flowers. This is a very important nectar and pollen source for bees and wasps and flies and some other pollinators. You can see the truncate leaf base here and here. The knotweeds and their hybrids are large. There is a dwarf garden variety that's less than 1 meter tall, but what you'll see in the wild is mostly, I would say, roughly 1.5 meters to 3 meters, maybe even a little taller for giant knotweed. Plants that look like giant knotweed are rare in our region, in my experience. The ones that look like Japanese knotweed are very common. They're mostly along roadsides and streams, which is where the dispersal seems to occur. This is giant knotweed, or a hybrid that's very close to giant knotweed. You can see the heart-shaped or cordate leaf base. The leaf is much larger. That's my hand, so this is a leaf that is going to be larger than your hand, often distinctly larger, can be quite a bit more than in this photograph. Here's an incipient stand that this is actually down at Denning's Point, which Rebecca Rue was talking about a few minutes ago. It's early enough that there doesn't seem to have been any leftover overwinter standing dead material, but this is a giant knotweed-like entity here, large leaves, heart-shaped leaf base. This one has a pretty heart-shaped base. And this is giant knotweed-like. And just to show you that it can in fact be a wetland plant, although it is more typically roadside or riparian. This is in the mouth of, I think it's Indian Brook, Foundry Brook or Indian Brook, or I'm sorry, this is Phillips Brook. There are 3 streams that drain into Constitution Island Marsh. This is right at the height of tide and just around mean high water. I would certainly consider that a wetland microhabitat. So I'm just going to make a comment or two about the knotweeds here. They are becoming very common. They are sometimes forming very large stands, especially along roadsides and some of the larger streams. There is a biological control program in development. I don't know when that's going to be available in the Northeast. Up until then, you can look at the Travis and Kiviat contracted project from a few years ago on the Lower Hudson PRISM website for then current information about managing knotweed on a small scale for, for example, in a homeowner's yard. Here's another species that I think we should be on the alert for. This is actually the invasive one. This is a native one that happens to have the same common name, frog's bit. Sort of unfortunate because the leaves are a little bit similar, but the flower is quite different. I haven't seen this native frog's bit linobium in our region. I have seen European frog's bit, Hydrocorus morsus rani, in Thompson Pond in Dutchess County, in the Bashakill, which I think is just outside the Lower Hudson PRISM region in Sullivan County, and in a small wetland associated with the south end of Mud Pond in Dutchess County. So it's here. I don't know how it disperses. It's something that may or may not become troublesome, but it's probably at the early detection, rapid response stage, if there is such a thing for European frog's bit. And this is a tier 2 species in Lower Hudson PRISM. These leaves are about, I would say, 7 or 8 centimeters across. The flower is roughly 2 to 3 centimeters across to give you scale. Yellow iris is fairly common in our region. This is Iris pseudochorus. It's a European species. It gave rise to the fleur-de-lis symbol in France. You can imagine that if you close your eyes for a minute and look at this flower. It's got that kind of fleur-de-lis, potentially stylized shape. This is a large iris. It's bigger than our native Iris versicolor, which is this. The yellow iris flowers are a little bit larger and the leaves are typically quite a bit larger. Yellow iris leaves can easily reach face height, which would be about 1.5 meters for me. Let's go back and look at this more closely. Here are the flowers and foliage, unmistakable. It's the only yellow iris that I know of that we would see in the wild here. This is a flower opening. It flowers in roughly early June. Fully open flower with a bud in front of it. And the same fully open flower from above. And this is Iris versicolor, the native blue iris, which is also fairly common. Iris versicolor. Now, I don't want to digress too far into this, but what I see of yellow iris, which seems to have been here, I would guess, for 1.5 centuries or longer, because it was a popular ornamental on old estates, as far as I can tell, is that it occurs as a clump or two here and there. It's fairly common, but it doesn't seem to become abundant except under rare circumstances. I did see one supratidal pool on Kruger Island in Annandale that was covered for, maybe 1/8 of an acre with yellow iris. I don't know if it's still like that. So there may be some invasive potential, but in the strict ecological sense of invasiveness, something that becomes very abundant and really displaces native plants of similar habitats, I don't see that happening now. I would say this is a species that you should monitor if it's near something important, like a rare plant or something else of concern. It's a tier 4 species in the Lower Hudson PRISM. Here are the fruits of yellow iris. They're quite large, so this would be the larger one, the more regularly shaped one on the right, would be probably 10 or 11 centimeters long, which is fairly typical, much larger than a wild blue iris fruit. Unfortunately, in vegetative condition, it's really hard to tell these two species apart, except that yellow iris does get to be quite a bit larger on average and in the extreme. So you may have to wait until June, maybe late May, to see plants flower to decide whether it's something that you need to keep an eye on. This is a marsh plant that is fairly common here. I don't think it's of particular concern as an invasive species. It is non-native. It's called moneywort, Lysomachia nummularia. It is unranked in the lower Hudson PRISM region. It's kind of a prostrate, creeping plant. The flowers are very conspicuous. They're about 3 centimeters across. This is the foliage here. It's a forb with kind of roundish opposite leaves that have a stem that runs along the wet soil. Here's a slightly zoomed out view. And, you know, again, I think I would watch this if there's something of conservation concern nearby. Is it capable of really overgrowing other plants? I'm not sure. I think the jury's out on that as far as I've seen. Okay, now we get to something really interesting. Let's skip ahead here for a moment. This, you all know what this is, I assume, unless you just moved here from somewhere very far away. This is purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria. These are not these graminoid leaves are not the purple loosestrife leaves. That's probably Phragmites or some other very large grass. The diagnostic feature of purple loosestrife, or one of the diagnostic features when it's in flower, is that the flowers are very crowded in a large terminal spike, as you can see here. This is the very tip of the plant up here. This whole spike is probably about, I'm going to say 25 or maybe 30 centimeters long from top to bottom. If we go back and look at a native plant in the same genus, Lythrum elatum, or winged loosestrife, the flowers are axillary. They're not crowded into a dense terminal inflorescence. They're associated with these reduced stem leaves at the top of the plant. And unlike purple loosestrife, which can easily be 2 meters or more tall, I measured one last year that was 3.4 meters tall. That's my record from soil to growing tip in growth position. In our region, Lythrum elatum, this winged loosestrife, really only gets to be 30 to maybe 60 centimeters tall. It seems to be a plant of calcareous wet meadows and fens. It's not particularly common, but it's not something you'd want to go hack down because you make a mistake and think it's just a stunted purple loosestrife. Now you might have more trouble with this. This is the native swamp loosestrife, Decodon verticillatus. It is in the Lythraceae, the purple loosestrife family. This is what the fruits look like when they're, you know, post dispersing their seeds in the fall or the winter. Here are the flowers of swamp loosestrife. The flowers are in little axillary clusters associated with the leaves. They're not in a terminal spike. They're about the size or a little bit bigger than purple loosestrife flowers, whereas winged loosestrife has smaller flowers. So these flowers of swamp loosestrife are probably 3 centimeters across, probably typically a little larger than purple loosestrife. And here's a a dense stand of the plant. The leaves in swamp loosestrife are typically whorled. That means there are 3 growing together at a node. Purple loosestrife typically has opposite leaves. Whorled leaves are not rare in purple loosestrife, so you can't just go by that. Swamp loosestrife almost always has an arching appearance like this. It grows up and then arches over, and then when the tip gets down into the water or onto wet mud, it often roots at the nodes near the tip of the plant. And here's another dense patch of swamp loosestrife, and you can see the arching growth habit of last year's stems that died back but overwintered, which all 3 of these plants do. And that's winged loosestrife again and purple loosestrife. And I do want to point out the reason there are animals in these photographs is because that's one of the things I do research on. So don't worry about this Dobson fly. But if you look at the purple loosestrife leaf, and this is looking at it from the underside, the veins kind of run together just before they reach the margin of the leaf. And that's a good diagnostic character, because if you see something superficially similar like a young plant of brook lime, Veronica anagallis aquatica, which is uncommon or fairly common here, it might look a lot like a sort of succulent, nutrient-fed purple loosestrife plant that hasn't gotten very tall yet. But I think purple loosestrife is the only one that has this feature where the veins run together and follow the edge of the leaf instead of going all the way to the edge. And just for general purposes here, purple loosestrife stems are usually very strongly angled, as you can see here. They're not quite winged, and winged loosestrife is only slightly more winged than this, so I wouldn't use that as an identification character. But you may know that other plants that often have square or almost winged stems or angled stems include a lot of the mints, things in the mint family, a lot of things in the figwort family, and not very much else. So that sometimes is helpful. And this is what purple loosestrife looks like in the winter. You know, if you're really interested in invasive plants and in trying to figure out where to worry about them and try to manage them, you should learn how to recognize them in the winter if there's anything left in the winter. And some of these bigger herbaceous or semi-woody plants like purple loosestrife and knotweed and Phragmites do have standing dead material that lasts more or less through the winter and often actually through the next growing season. And again, to distinguish this from swamp loosestrife, it's more erect typically. The fruits here are in terminal spikes that are, by this time of the year, very stretched out and narrow. And it doesn't have that arching growth habit that is much more typical. In fact, in the background here, I think that some of this might be swamp loosestrife. I can't tell in this photograph. All right, so enough about purple loosestrife. Now, here's another plant that we have an interesting conundrum about. You probably all are familiar with Phragmites, common reed, Phragmites australis. It is, so Phragmites is a tier 4 species. I don't have a note here, but I'm assuming purple loosestrife is also a tier 4. In other words, something that's very, very abundant that one has to be very strategic about managing for a particular local reason. The dilemma about Phragmites is that there is native and non-native Phragmites. And this is only something that's really been, as much as one can prove this at all, it's really only been proven for about 20 years largely through the work of Kristen Saltonstall. Almost all of what we have in the Hudson Valley and beyond for ways is non-native or European or Old World or haplotype M purple loosestrife. I'm sorry, Phragmites, common reed. And this seems to have come here from Europe. It could have blown across the ocean. It could have come in a lot of different human-aided ways. There's been quite a lot of fanciful speculation about that in the literature. How do you distinguish non-native common reed from native common reed? Because just in the last few years, Ed McGowan discovered native common reed in a Hudson River marsh down in the Brackish River, because that's a very open system. The estuarine system could well be in other Hudson River tidal marshes, and it could be inland as well. I'm currently looking at some Phragmites that looks like this. This is a short distance inland from the river near Kingston, and it exhibits one of the not definitive, but kind of an early image that you look for native common reed, and that is that the lower internodes, that is I would say the lower meter roughly of the aerial stem, the vertical stem of common reed. On the native reed, the leaf sheaths, which are these things, tend to kind of curl up and often fall off early in the growing season. And then it seems that the exposed internode, which was previously hidden under the sheath, develops red pigment, probably anthocyanin pigment, when it's exposed to the sun. So if you see something like this, it could be native common reed, but it might also be non-native common reed. And I've been fooled by this character a couple of times in our region. And so I'm in the process of collecting specimens of these plants in the photograph to have them worked up genetically to see if they are indeed native or non-native, and if they're native, to find out more about the genetics, because common reed is very, very variable genetically at all scales that you can imagine, from one side of a pond to the other, to one continent to another. So curiously, North America seems to be a center of evolutionary radiation for native common reed, and it has a number of haplotypes and other variants in North America. And native common reed is more of common occurrence as you go southward or westward from the Hudson Valley. This is non-native common reed. Another confusion that I've stumbled over a few times is that if you see a large reed canarygrass stem that hasn't flowered yet, it might look a lot like a small Phragmites stem that hasn't flowered yet. And that, you know, they don't sound similar because there's usually a big size difference, but they can actually look superficially rather similar. And the best way to tell them apart is to look at the ligule. And I pulled this away from the stem or culm here. This is the junction between the leaf blade the big flat wavy part, and the leaf sheath, which is partly torn away from the stem here. And this is the ligule here. There's just a little rim of tissue, a fraction of a millimeter high usually. It also early in the season typically has some, there's only one visible in this photograph, some long white hairs. These can be almost a centimeter long. So here's a mnemonic for common reed. Think of Harry Reid, the former senator. Sorry, I apologize for my sense of humor. One needs that these days. This is what a reed canarygrass ligule looks like. This happens to be a variegated garden variety of reed canarygrass. That was what I had handy to photograph. But look at this ligule, this whole whitish, translucent, kind of chaffy thing that can be almost a centimeter long. It's tearing apart here. It's very fragile. That whole thing is the ligule. So that's very different from the common reed ligule. There are other giant grasses that you can potentially confuse with common reed. Some of them are planted as ornament. Pampas grass, cordaderia is one of them. Giant reed, arundo is another one. Undoubtedly, there are other things that people want to have in their gardens that look like common reed while we're out trying to reduce the abundance of common reed. It's ironic, but true. Here's another close-up of the common reed ligule. Here's this little thing here. It's just a little rim of tissue that's less than a millimeter high. In native common reed, this is supposed to be bigger. I don't know how universal that feature is. They're not always that easy to distinguish morphologically. And here are these lovely sort of distinctive long white hairs that tend to wear off during the growing season. Okay, so that's common reed. Now, I think this is the last species. This is not really invasive in the narrow sense of the term that I use. It is generally agreed upon as a non-native species. This is Solanum dulcamara. It's called Bittersweet Nightshade, and it has other common names. My father used to refer to it as deadly nightshade, which is a common name also given to other Solanum species. If you know what a tomato flower or a potato flower looks like, forget the colors. This is the shape of the flower. The petals are reflex. They turn down or backwards. Typically, the styles are united into a column. I think those are those probably are not the styles. Those are the anthers of the stamens, united into a column in the middle of the flower. This looks like the style here. So it's got this sort of pointy, streamlined look to it. This is a vine. It's a weakly woody vine. It does overwinter above ground. It is a wetland or wetland edge plant often, but not exclusively. It's been here for a long time, probably hundreds of years in the eastern US. And, you know, if someone has made a contradictory observation, I'd love to hear about it, but I don't see evidence of this becoming very abundant or really overgrowing other plants to the point of harm. It's an interesting plant. Here it is climbing. It's a twiner, so it spirals around other plants in order to get up above the ground. Here it is twining around knotweed. These are the fruits. Sometimes they get a deeper red than this. Could partly be the light in this photograph. You should know what this plant is that the bittersweet nightshade is twining on. This is common reed. And this is a slightly unusual, lovely purple color that I found one fall or late summer at Buttercup Sanctuary in Dutchess County. So that's it here. Linda, Joyce, are there any questions that have come up?
Guys, if anybody has any questions, please either type them in the chat box, or if you like, you can unmute yourself and ask.
We could certainly have a discussion now. Do we have a few minutes for that?
Yeah, we have time. We're
Great.
good. So I had a question, which I think Chris answered, but I'll put it to you too. And that was for the flowering rush. Is there a way to to identify that when it's not in flower?
Unfortunately, I have almost no experience with flowering rush. I've seen it on the St. Lawrence River in the freshwater tidal wetlands. So I can't comment on that, but I'll look it up. You know, you piqued my interest, and if I can find something useful, I will email. I'll send something to the PRISM list. Or
Chris said he thought that it's twisted at the tips of the leaves, but he's not sure how constant that characteristic is.
Good question. So, you know, there are several marsh plants that have this kind of graminoid middle height, you know, a meter or so, often dense foliage. Another one is sweet flag Acorus, which is now considered to have a native and non-native species, Acorus americanus and Acorus calamus. And you know, you could, I suppose, if you're not used to looking at the plants or from a distance, you could confuse Butomus with one of the irises or any number of other graminoids.
So there's also a question here. It says, have you seen much Lysimachia vulgaris along the Hudson? This is from Chris. He says he's seen it on the Housatonic and Connecticut rivers.
I have not seen it that I remember. So it was either once or not at all, probably not at all. I think I've seen it inland where, you know, maybe a more recent garden escape, but I'll watch for it.
And then Julie Rubin said, when might biological control for knotweed be available? And I guess anybody could answer this if you have information about it.
Yeah, well, I'll say something brief and then let Kathy McGlynn or Carrie Brown Lima comment on that. My understanding is that it's on the verge of being released or being released in the Pacific Northwest. My guess is we're a couple of years away from that in the Northeast, but sometime in the near future.
Yeah. Ryan did a link. But who was that?
Hi, Linda. This is Carrie. Hi, Eric. Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah. Hi, Carrie.
I just wanted to comment. We actually have already released the biocontrol for knotweed in New York State on a very small scale. It is available and federally approved, and with a permit, it can be released anywhere in the US. However, its effectiveness is questionable at this point. It has been released previously in the UK and in Canada, and hasn't shown great success in establishment or at reducing knotweed populations. So we're happy that it finally got approved, but we are cautious about being too optimistic about how successful this agent will be. There's research also to find second agents that could potentially complement this moving forward. But for now, it's available in limited quantities and just more on a testing basis right now. It's already been tested and approved for safeness. It's just, we're just seeing how it fares as far as establishing and having an impact.
Okay. Thanks, Carrie. Nice to have the experts or the people in the know on the call. Anybody else have any other questions for Erik?
I just want to say one ecological comment about knotweed. I've been finding quite a few songbird nests in knotweed stands. It could be a square meter of knotweed. It could be 1,000 square meters. It doesn't seem to be dependent on the extent of the stand. They are, for the most part, common species of songbirds, probably 8 or 10 different species. And this has also been reported in a number of other states in the northern US now. So that's not a reason to not manage knotweed, but I would certainly, if you have a choice about when you're cutting or spraying or covering with plastic or doing something else, I would wait until the catbirds and the other common songbirds in your area are finished nesting, which would probably be the end of July, roughly. American goldfinch is one of the species that can nest in knotweed. They nest all through the very end of the summer, but I don't think you're going to find that species nesting in knotweed. It's mostly catbirds, cardinals, probably brown thrashers, American robin, and several other songbirds that I can't think of right now.
All right, thank you very much, Erik, for a really good presentation on different plants we can find in wetlands in this area and how to identify them. I'm going to get the screen back here, and we'll move into our 15-minute break. And we will resume at 2:35 with our next presentation. And what I'll do when we start up again is I will share Mike's presentation initial slide, and I'll start with his introduction. So when you see the screen change, and of course when we start talking again, we'll be resuming.